You know, most older Pokemon that are good tend to slowly increasingly get worse in relation to other Pokemon as this series introduces more power creep. It's an unfortunate reality of this long-running series that's always introducing new monsters and mechanics. Even the mighty Tyranitar and Garchomp have fallen in comparison to some of their recent contemporaries in Gen 9. Of course, these are more graceful compared to other Pokemon, as being in the overused tier and competitive for so long, and only now going into underused is still admirable. And I'm sure Tyranitar is quite good in that tier now. But then, there are even older Pokemon, like Venusaur. Literally the first evolution line in the entire National Dex. And if you look at how it's held up in comparison to the rest of the roster, it's extremely respectable, all things considered. It's officially not in Gen 9 yet, but it's managed to avoid going down to never used for its entire existence without any gimmicks, which is incredible for a Gen 1 starter. And this translates to single player too. It's been good to use in playthroughs since Red, Blue, and Yellow. And as a Bulbasaur lover, that's pretty cool. That brings us to today's subject, however. As interesting as Venusaur is when it comes to the legacy of Gen 1 starters, Charizard might be even more interesting. Because Venusaur has some degree of consistency, but Charizard is absolutely all over the place from generation to generation. Few starter Pokemon were as dramatically affected in both good and bad ways from generation to generation as this Fire Lizard. And that's why I've decided to tackle this subject today. What are the best and worst versions of Charizard? Sure, we've seen plenty of very good documentation on Charizard throughout competitive. But what about single player on top of that? How did the immensely popular Charizard fare in terms of expectation versus reality throughout the series? Also, Mismagius, Heartgold, Rando, Hardcore Nuzlocke if you like challenges. Link will be in the description below. Alright. So the most important generation to talk about regarding this subject might be its debut generation, since this was its very first impression in the uncontrollable wave of popularity with the series debut. You know, Pokemania. Charizard being treated as this Pokemon that was too strong for the main protagonist of the still relatively new Pokemon anime to control and give commands to consistently, and was always made out to be this mega badass. So obviously expectations were high if you were playing the games already, having seen that. And unfortunately, this is where I rip the band-aid off right now. Charizard in Gen 1 kinda sucks. You saw the thumbnail. Okay, it's not that bad on its own. It has pretty decent stats and really good speed by Gen 1's pre-power creep standards. But it's a fire type, and being a fire type is awful in Gen 1. It doesn't get to learn Flamethrower until level 46, which is pretty miserable. You can get Fire Blast after the 7th gym, which is pretty late, but it's better than only having Ember. Though in single player, moves with only 5 base PP in itself isn't always going to be as desirable as Flamethrower. Speaking of playthrough potential, its most infamous issue is really struggling against Brock and Misty. It's not until Erica that you feel a bit rewarded for choosing Charmander. And even then, Erica isn't exactly difficult to begin with. People have talked a lot of smack about Gen 2 movesets, but this is clearly worse than what Typhlosion deals with, as Typhlosion can at least get Flame Wheel after Ember. Not great, but better than being stuck with Ember as your most used fire attack for such a long time. Though, the level Typhlosion learns Flamethrower at in Gen 2 is pretty embarrassing. Actually, yeah, maybe that's gonna be worse for a lot of players. Oh, and I forgot to mention, since there's no special split, its special attack is just 85, not 109 like from Gen 2 and on. Pretty mediocre when your typing is already a bit of an uphill battle. While it could still be worse, it's always going to be judged unfavorably next to Blastoise and Venusaur in Red, Blue, and Yellow. While Blastoise has almost no presence in standard competitive play, it's a very good Pokemon for playthroughs, and Venusaur is respected in both categories, albeit more so in-game in Gen 1. At the very least, Charizard does look cool. It's pretty good in the NU tier, and the Japanese box art for Red featuring Charizard proudly might be the best cover in the series. So hey, it's got that. Moving on to Gen 2, where we see a giant improvement for Charizard. Its special attack increased thanks to the special split. But that wasn't the only great thing that happened to it. The fire typing was indirectly buffed due to the introduction of the steel typing, and some of the best Pokemon in the game were of course steel. So this made the fire type more useful overall, though it still wasn't nearly as good as it would be later on. Charizard isn't exactly a Pokemon you're going to see in most normal Gold, Silver, Crystal playthroughs, but in competitive, it shot up to the underused ban list. A bit of a cursed place to be if you actually wanted to use it in a tier, but it does have sweeping potential in OU if you catch someone off guard with the perfect belly drum setup, but it's unbelievably niche. But yeah, Gen 2 Charizard, a nice upgrade, very respectable. Next, we're going big time, because Gen 3 Charizard is yet another glow up for both competitive and non-competitive players. Since Kanto got a remake in Gen 3 with Fire Red and Leaf Green, Charizard is now once again a very relevant Pokemon in-game, and it might be the best starter choice if you're combining both in-game and competitive factors. If you are only counting in-game stuff, I think Venusaur and Blastoise will be more friendly toward beginner players, however. Even Professor Oak's dialogue when you go to choose Charmander notes that it should be raised patiently. But that being said, the buffs to Charizard make Brock and Misty much easier for it, especially Brock since Charmander gets Metal Claw. Getting Flamethrower much earlier is also quite nice. Flamethrower with Sunny Day alone is kind of insane for single player stuff, and a Sunny Day set is very viable and competitive, especially with more good steel types having been added to the game. Charizard actually has a lot of competitive options, like Beat Up and Belly Drum, but Belly Drum isn't as popular in Gen 3 for it as it used to be. And while it has competition for a team spot with Moltres, Charizard's superior speed is actually insanely important in Gen 3, and really has made it a very popular fire type option over the years in that meta. My editor actually did a playthrough of Leaf Green not too long ago before doing this video, and even surrounded by a bunch of lower level Pokemon, he was able to clear the Elite Four with a team based around Charizard without too much of a headache. It was just that good if you optimized it correctly. Obviously, that's a big upgrade over Gen 1. It came a long way. And this could be the best version of Charizard when you consider the other Pokemon available at the time. Certainly the best without a major gimmick. Unfortunately, Gen 4 is where Charizard became a little bit of a meme. A little move called Stealth Rock was added. And Charizard is the poster child for Pokemon affected horribly by it with its 4 times weakness to it. And yeah, Stealth Rock was that good. Being weak to it really meant some Pokemon were just out of the game. If you look at Charizard on sites like Smogon, you'll notice it goes from OU all the way down to NU from Gens 3 to 4. That kind of drop doesn't usually happen. This is also around the time where online battling got more popular, and the popular Charizard would sometimes get dropped into a standard overused tier match. Obviously, it's not good at all there, even with a great move pool, but I do think all of the tiers have value, and it's actually really good in the NU tier. It's still better than Gen 1 Charizard for sure, because if you decide to use Charizard in any single player content, it's still pretty good. NPCs won't have teams centered around countering it, so it's fine. Gen 5 Charizard is generally the same in terms of its perceived status, just with a different meta. It's great in the never used tier once again, but isn't great in overused standard play at all. It's not typically available in Generation 5 for single player content, so it's hard to have much else to say. But again, if you want to use it competitively, while it's not great in standard play, it's seriously awesome in NU. Don't underestimate how fun these lower tiers can be. And now, the one a lot of you have been waiting for, Gen 6. Man, they were really biased towards this thing in X and Y, giving it 2 Mega Evolutions instead of the usual 1. But you know what? My preference for Venusaur aside, both of these forms are really cool. And not only that, both these Mega forms for Charizard are among the best Pokemon in Gen 6. Now, in competitive, this changed a bit depending on what era of Gen 6 you're in. that being X and Y or Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. But still, it's all close enough. It was among the top tiers when the generation was new, and was still really high tier and very common by the time folks were preparing to move on to the next gen. Considering that in terms of movesets and stat priority, there was nothing inherently wrong with Charizard by this point. It just didn't fit in the way something like Volcarona did anymore. But when you add the stats of a Mega Evolution on top of it, suddenly it's able to brute force its way into relevancy whether you like it or not. But definitely far from the point where it would be banned to the Uber tier with Pokemon like Mewtwo. Between forms X and Y, it'll depend on the team you want it to be a part of. Being able to ditch its flying type for Dragon was quite good in many scenarios, but the flying type wasn't bad either, as it could actually catch Landorus T off guard. What about single player, you might ask? You can pick up a Kanto starter during your journey in X and Y, but does it really matter? Gen 6 is pretty easy, and even its normal form meets the standard for being a good Pokemon to have in your party for your in-game playthrough. Not too much else to say in that regard. In Gen 7, Charizard was still able to access its Megas, so I won't drone on about how good it is here too much. It felt a little better and a little more relevant in Gen 6, but that's partly because of the natural power creep that happened as we went to Gen 7. Toxapex, for example, is just so good that a lot of Pokemon just naturally move down because of it. And the meta was of course just a little different. But again, it's a very good generation for Charizard regardless. You may be thinking,
oh no, those Megas got removed in Gen 8. Charizard sucks now.
But that's not as true as you might think. Without getting in the Gmax yet, Charizard was actually able to play surprisingly well in multiple tiers of Gen 8's competitive. Now, it's not a staple at all, and it's technically tiered PU if you check, but heavy-duty boots were a godsend to this thing. And its move options are quite good, so things like Sun strategies were actually good. That being said, it's obviously not even close to the same impact as the generations where it had Mega Evolutions. Now, for that Gmax form, technically, it's the strongest Charizard has ever been. It kinda melted everything, and any time where it was legal to use, you were likely to see it, like VGC. But it's banned to anything goes otherwise. You're not even seeing it in Ubers. Gmax was just too much. That means I'm not going to count this entirely as far as the best version, because the gimmick is admittedly kind of insane. It feels more like a boss encounter thing at times than a normal powerful mechanic like Mega Evolutions. So we'll call this the best version of Charizard in a technical sense, but I won't be counting it entirely for this video due to just how crazy and obvious it is, and the fact that it was banned in most standard competitive play. And finally, we're at Gen 9. Now, it's still very new here, and the generation isn't over, but it's pretty clear that Charizard isn't going to be at its highest level of play here. That being said, it's a good Pokemon to use for single player content once again, due to its perfectly fine stats, aided with its good move pool and available items. And I expect a lot of people to use it, since we're not done with the DLC releases and updates for Scarlet and Violet yet. For competitive, it still has heavy-duty boots as an option and stuff, with some niche options in OU, in spite of its much lower tier placement. We'll see how it ends up faring over time, but I don't think its placement will change too much. So, what is the best version of Charizard? Well, for me, not counting the crazy mechanic that is Gmax in Gen 8, I gotta give it to Gen 3 and Gen 6. In Gen 3, it manages to be one of the best Pokemon in the entire game without needing an extra form or relying on a generation-specific gimmick. The fire typing was improved, and it just was able to take advantage of its many options more than it ever had. But Gen 6 was where it was most known for being a powerful Pokemon thanks to its Megas. It's hard to say which of the two I'd pick if I had to. Gen 6 Charizard was overall better, but I just think Generation 3 Charizard not needing any additional forms to be good is still more impressive to me. As for the worst, I gotta give it to Gen 1 Charizard. I mean, come on. Gen 1 was hard on a lot of Pokemon depending on the typing, like fighting types. But yeah, Charizard is definitely not the worst Pokemon in Red, Blue, and Yellow, but it's definitely the worst version of the beloved Fire Lizard overall. Yeah, it's good in the never used tier and competitive, but it feels the worst to play out of all generations for in-game playthroughs. And even though it's not PU tier, it doesn't really have any good strategies in the upper tiers like it does in Gen 8 and 9. So yeah, I'm comfortable with this one being the worst version. And that's it, the best and worst versions of Charizard. Did you agree with this quick generation to generation overview? What's your favorite generation to use it in? Let me know your thoughts down below. We've got a lot of content coming up for this last stretch of 2023, so thank you guys so much for the support, and until next time.